Now, let's logically spice up our code a bit. What if we wanted to write a program that only prints out even numbers and only prints out the number of even numbers that the user specifies? Well, there are 3 different ways to do this. I'll only go over one of them right now with you, but try to see if you can figure out the other 2. One might be a bit more hidden than the other, but I'm sure you can get it. Do some Googling, as that is a pretty big deal in computer science. The way that we're going to go over together is my personal favorite. Instead of the last line simply being print I, what if we did print I times 2? How does that change the program? Well, recall that any number times 2, despite it being even or odd, is an even number, which means that it is essentially going to be a multiple of 2. And since we're counting up from 1 to 100, or whatever the user specifies, we're essentially only counting the even numbers if you multiply by 2. So let's say the user says a number like 10, then the numbers we print out are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20, aka the first 10 multiples of 2. So that's for loops. We've written 3 different programs so far today. One that prints 1 through 100, pretty non-dynamic, but it does the job. The other takes input from the user and prints that number, prints that as the upper bound and prints all of the numbers that come before it. And finally, one that prints all of the even numbers, and specifically the amount of even numbers that the user specifies. But recall, I said that there are 2 different types of loops: for loops and while loops. While loops are essentially just a different type of loop in Python that the programmer can utilize to their best effort. Because while loops make it so that the programmer can think a lot more logically, and it allows the programmer to actually run a program an infinite amount of times. For loops kind of also do this, but we're not going to get into that today. Just remember, each type of loop has their own nuanced uses. And it's an important skill to develop to realize when you should use a while loop over a for loop and vice versa. So let's take that second to last program we wrote and convert it to a while loop. Again, we're working backwards in this lesson because I feel like that's just a simpler way to learn about loops. So here you can see the program that is going to do exactly what that for loop program did. Notice there is no variable creation in the while loop. That's because while loops only have one singular condition, which is essentially a Boolean expression. In fact, in many ways, while loops are similar in spirit to if statements. And they can even be read out in English, the same way that if statements can. While something is true, do this. But when that thing isn't true anymore, stop doing this. That's essentially the logic behind a while loop, and essentially why while loops are effective. Because they work so well in English, and they can do something an infinite amount of times. So we take input in the same manner as before, and then we declare a variable called I. Again, this variable could be called anything you want it to be called, but I and many other programmers just personally prefer the letter I, standing for iteration. So now we can look at the condition of the while loop. While I is less than or equal to the input that the user specified. Why do we do it like this? Well, if I is less than or equal to the input, then it's going to print that many amount of times. It's going to print the numbers until it's not. But how does I change? Well, let's look inside of the while loop now. So the first line is obviously just print, and it's just printing I. But the second line is where things get interesting. In for loops, I changes on its own. In while loops, the programmer has to manually change I. So here we do I plus equal 1, which essentially just sets I to itself plus 1. Thus, I changes every iteration by 1 and still prints. And until I gets to that upper limit that the user sets, I is going to keep printing. So as you can see, our program is able to pretty concisely and effectively print all of those statements. However, there are a few problems with while loops that I would like to quickly go over. For one, it's really easy to forget that very last line of code and lead to an infinite loop, which obviously has several problems regarding computer memory and just how you're going to stop the program. That's a problem, so it's important to recall how that last statement, and it's important to remember to write that last statement. But with its downsides come its upsides. Now let's write a program that instead of printing even numbers, it prints odd numbers. For the purposes of this program, let's assume that the upper limit that the user specifies is an odd number. Well, I'll give you a minute to think about this and write this program yourself. Pause the video and come back and we'll go over it together. Alright, did you get this? Good. The only thing we really have to change is that very last line. Instead of doing I plus equals 1, we can do I plus equals 2, which will give us the correct answer, and it'll just print 1, and it'll add 2 to 1, and give us 3, add 2 to 3, give us 5, and so on, until I is equal to the upper bound that the user has set. It'll run that line, and then it'll just break out of the loop. Alright, I know that's a lot of code for one day, but I really hope you understood everything. And more importantly, I hope you understood why we wrote every line that we did. Because understanding those things is a really crucial step in furthering yourself as a computer scientist. And that's very important at the very beginning of your computer science journey. That's all for now, folks. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. If you did, make sure you like the video. And if you want to continue your computer science journey, hit subscribe right here. If you want to go to the very next video in the series, click here and go to that.